For most of his 72 years, Ray Whittaker lived at the end of a narrow road in Odd, West Virginia. Not the kind of road people casually turn down. The kind that feels like it ends before it begins. Trees closing in, mud swallowing tires. A place so tucked away that even locals rarely pass through unless they already knew exactly who lived there. For decades, Ray existed almost entirely outside the public record. No job history, no interviews, no voice in any formal sense. He didn't write. He didn't speak in sentences. He didn't explain himself to the world because he couldn't. His life moved quietly, measured not in milestones but in routines. Wake up, eat, sit, wander the yard, listen for familiar voices, retreat when strangers came too close. And then one day, the world noticed him. Not through a social worker, not through a medical report, not through a neighbor's call, through a screen. Short videos began circulating online. Clips of an older man with a weathered face and hollow eyes, barking, grunting, recoiling from eye contact, pacing through a cluttered yard. To some viewers, it was shocking. To others, fascinating. To some, darkly entertaining. The internet did what it always does when it encounters someone who cannot explain themselves. It projected meaning. People asked, "What's wrong with him?" People laughed. People speculated. Very few asked what it meant to live more than 7 decades without the ability to say, "I'm afraid," or "I don't understand," or "Please don't take me." Ray could not narrate his own suffering. He could only react to it. Then, almost as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone. In late 2025, after reports surfaced involving drugs, unsafe conditions, and possible exploitation of the most vulnerable members of the Whittaker family, Adult Protective Services arrived at the property. They did not come with cameras. They did not come with speeches. They came with paperwork and authority. 3 adults were removed from the land that day. Ray, Lorraine, Timmy. All 3 were adults with severe intellectual disabilities. All 3 had spent decades on that same piece of land. All 3 were taken without ceremony. They did not pack belongings. They were not eased into a transition. They were not given explanations they could meaningfully understand. They were simply taken. Ray's sister Betty stood in the doorway of the collapsing home afterward. The house behind her sagged under its own weight. Rusted metal and broken furniture littered the yard. When asked what she felt, she said only, "I miss them a lot. I raised them." Larry, Ray's brother, tried to explain what had happened, but he didn't know where Ray had been taken. The state would not tell him. Privacy laws, safety protocols, procedure. To some watching from the outside, this moment looked like justice. 3 vulnerable adults rescued from conditions that appeared dangerous. A long overdue intervention. To others, it felt like something else entirely. A quiet removal. A 72-year-old man who barely understood the outside world, driven away from the only place he had ever known. Both interpretations can exist at once. That is the uncomfortable truth at the center of this story. Because when someone like Ray is removed, 2 realities collide. One is legal and procedural. The other is deeply human. Safety does not automatically translate to understanding. Protection does not automatically feel like rescue when you cannot grasp why your world is disappearing. This is not a story about whether intervention should ever happen. It is a story about what happens after the intervention and what came before anyone thought to act. Ray's life did not begin the day Adult Protective Services arrived. It did not begin when cameras rolled. It began decades earlier, shaped by isolation, genetics, poverty, and promises made inside a family that had almost no outside support. For most of his life, Ray's world was small. The house, the yard, the same faces every day. Even when conditions were harsh, they were familiar. Familiarity was not comfort. It was survival. He knew which footsteps belonged to which person. He knew which voices meant food, which meant rest, which meant danger. He knew where he was allowed to exist without explanation. That kind of predictability matters more than most people realize, especially for someone who processes the world through sensation instead of language. When that predictability is removed suddenly, the nervous system doesn't understand help. It understands loss. When Ray was taken, he did not know he was being rescued. He did not know what unsafe meant. He did not know why strangers were in charge. He only knew that the environment his body recognized vanished. From the outside, the story moved quickly. Reports were written. Headlines formed. Debates exploded online. Some people demanded accountability. Others demanded compassion. Very few paused long enough to imagine what that moment felt like from inside Ray's body. A man who could not ask questions. A man who could not argue. A man who could not consent or resist in any way the system recognizes. That is why this series slows everything down. Because Ray's disappearance is not just a procedural step in a larger case. It is a rupture, a line dividing a hidden life from a public emergency. And once you start asking how a man could live 70 years without words, you have to ask a harder question. How many systems failed quietly before the state finally acted? In the chapters that follow, we will step backward, into Ray's silence, into the family history that shaped him, into the house the world ignored for decades, into the cameras that turned a private existence into content, and into the chain of decisions that led to that quiet car ride away from everything he knew. This is not about assigning easy villains or heroes. It is about understanding what happens when vulnerability, visibility, and power collide. And once you understand that, it becomes impossible to look at Ray Whittaker, or anyone like him, as just another clip on a screen. Before there were cameras, before there were reports, before there was a state vehicle turning around at the end of a dirt road, there was a man who could not tell anyone what his life felt like. Ray Whittaker did not grow up learning words the way most people do. He did not learn how to shape sounds into explanations or questions or protests. What developed instead was something more primitive and more fragile, a way of responding to the world through instinct rather than language. Born in 1953, Ray entered a family system already shaped by forces long before him. The Whittaker family tree is not just unusual, it is structurally compressed. Multiple generations of close relatives married within the same small circle. Identical twins whose children married each other. Double cousins. Repeated consanguinity over decades. This isn't gossip. It's documented reality. Medical research is clear about what that kind of genetic overlap can produce. Severe intellectual disabilities, neurological impairments, sensory processing disorders, speech loss, emotional regulation difficulties. Ray's life aligns almost perfectly with that profile. But here's the part people often miss. Severe disability does not equal absence of awareness. People who spend time with Ray have consistently said the same thing. He could understand simple speech. When his name was spoken, he reacted. When instructions were repeated slowly, he followed them. He recognized familiar people. He reacted differently to strangers than to family. Ray did not live in an empty mental space. He lived in a crowded one, full of sensation, confusion, fear, attachment, without the tools to organize or communicate it. So when a stranger locked eyes with him, he didn't say, "Please don't stare." He barked. When voices grew loud, he didn't say, "This is too much." He grunted and retreated. When people moved too close, he didn't say, "I don't feel safe." He ran. Those sounds were not random. They were his language. But on the internet, those reactions were rarely treated that way. Clips reduced them to spectacle, shock value, proof of how different he was. Few viewers stopped to consider that every bark might have been a sentence he never learned how to form. I'm overwhelmed. I'm afraid. I don't know what you want. Ray's world was not built for understanding. It was built for endurance. He spent nearly his entire life on the same patch of land in Odd, West Virginia, a place so isolated that even emergency services had to navigate carefully. The Whittaker home sat far from consistent public oversight. There is no evidence in reporting of long-term professional support, no rotating therapists, no regular medical interventions, no structured developmental programs. Instead, Ray depended almost entirely on family members who were themselves aging, impoverished, and often impaired in their own ways. His sister Betty has said, "More than once, I raised them." She has also said she promised her mother she would never marry, that she would stay and care for her siblings. That promise shaped Ray's life more than any policy ever did. Inside that promise lived love, exhaustion, isolation, and limits no one involved was equipped to overcome. Betty was not trained to handle profound disability. She was not supported by a system that stepped in early. She did what many families in rural poverty do. She survived by holding things together as best she could. Ray's survival depended on familiarity, on repetition, on knowing that the same voices would be there tomorrow. People misunderstand this point constantly. They imagine stability as cleanliness, order, and improvement. But for someone like Ray, stability meant recognition, knowing which sounds meant food, knowing where he was allowed to sit, knowing which people would not disappear without warning. His nervous system adapted to that narrow world. It learned its boundaries. It learned what not to expect. And that's why the idea of rescue is more complicated than it sounds. Because while Ray's environment was undeniably unsafe in many ways, it was also the only environment his body knew how to survive in. There was no gradual expansion of his world, no slow acclimation to outside systems, no preparation for change. He did not build resilience through exploration. He built tolerance through confinement. When visitors came over the years, accounts describe the same pattern. Ray reacted strongly. Eye contact triggered flight. New voices triggered distress. His responses were often interpreted as aggression or oddity. But in clinical terms, they look far more like sensory overload and fear responses. The world moved too fast, too loud, too unpredictable. So he withdrew. He learned that minimizing interaction reduced distress. He learned that retreat was safer than engagement. This is how a person disappears while still being alive. By the time the internet discovered Ray, his nervous system had spent decades reinforcing the same message. Stay small, stay back, stay quiet if you want to survive. That is not a choice. It is adaptation. And adaptation hardens into identity. When people ask why Ray didn't leave, why he didn't seek help, why he didn't do something, they're asking questions that assume agency he never had. Ray could not leave. He could not seek help. He could not articulate need in a way the system recognizes, which means the system's failure did not begin the day adult protective services arrived. It began with decades of absence. Absence of early intervention, absence of consistent medical care, absence of oversight in a place that few people ever visited. Ray's life was shaped by what didn't happen as much as by what did. And then there is the emotional cost that no report can measure. Attachment. Ray formed attachments the only way he could, through presence, through routine, through proximity. Betty's voice, Larry's movements, the familiar rhythm of the house, no matter how broken it was. Attachment does not require words. It requires consistency. So when Ray was removed, it wasn't just a change of address. It was the sudden collapse of the only attachment system his brain had ever built. Imagine being 72 years old and waking up somewhere unfamiliar, surrounded by people who do not know your sounds, your cues, your patterns. People who may be well-intentioned, but who do not speak your language. For many adults, that would be terrifying. For someone like Ray, it could be disorienting beyond comprehension. This does not mean intervention was wrong. It means intervention without preparation carries its own harm. And this is where most public discussions stop being honest. People argue about blame, about who should have acted sooner, about whether the family failed or the state failed. But Ray's experience exists beneath all of that. His body does not process policy debates. It processes disruption. The tragedy here is not just that Ray lived in unsafe conditions. It's that no system intervened early enough to give him alternatives that didn't involve total rupture. By the time action came, there was no gentle way to do it. In the next part, we're going to step inside the place Ray lived, not to sensationalize it, but to understand why officials eventually felt they had no choice. We'll look at the house not as a backdrop for viral footage, but as a physical environment that shaped Ray's daily reality, and why the same place could be both his refuge and his danger. Because once you understand the house, you understand why this story ended the way it did. To understand why the state eventually intervened, you have to understand the place Ray Whittaker lived, not as a viral backdrop, not as shock content, but as a physical environment that shaped every hour of his life. The Whittaker property sat at the end of a narrow dirt road in Odd, West Virginia, not tucked away in a poetic sense, but functionally isolated. No sidewalks, no passing traffic, no casual oversight. You didn't stumble upon a Whittaker home. You had to be looking for it. And for decades, no one was. When reporters finally visited after Adult Protective Services removed Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, they described something more complex than poverty alone. This wasn't just a poor home. It was a space that had slipped out of time. The structures on the land were decaying unevenly, as if the property had been abandoned in stages. Trailers leaned into the hillside, rusted and half swallowed by weeds. Fences sagged, no longer separating anything from anything else. Old furniture sat outside long past its usefulness, dissolving into the ground. Tires, cans, broken appliances, remnants of years where nothing left because there was nowhere for it to go. The yard wasn't cluttered in the way a busy family's yard gets cluttered. It was static. Objects remained where they had been left for years. The landscape itself seemed tired. Inside the house, the danger became less abstract. Journalists described a kitchen where a stove had been left on with food still cooking. Congealed beans and sausage hardened onto burners. Flies hovered. The smell of gas hung in the air. This wasn't a momentary lapse. It was a hazard that could have killed everyone inside. There was no functioning indoor bathroom. An outhouse stood outside, itself deteriorating. Windows were cracked or broken. Insects moved freely. Floors were uneven. The air carried layers of old smoke, food, and rot. Decorations from different holidays hung together in confusion. A Halloween skeleton drooped beside a Christmas angel. Not irony, not humor, just evidence that time passed without order. For most adults, this would be unsafe. For Ray, it was dangerous in a way that's hard to explain unless you understand disability. Ray could not identify danger verbally. He could not call for help. He could not recognize a gas leak as a gas leak. He could not assess risk and take corrective action. He depended entirely on others to notice danger for him. And those others, Betty and Larry, were doing what they could with limited resources, declining health, and no meaningful institutional support. This is where public narratives tend to fracture. Some people look at the house and see neglect, full stop. Others see poverty and abandonment by the state. Both are partially true, but neither tells the whole story. The house was unsafe. It was also Ray's entire world. Those rooms were where he slept every night, where he heard the same voices, where he knew where to sit, where to pace, where to retreat when overwhelmed. The physical danger existed alongside emotional familiarity. This is the contradiction that no one wants to sit with. You can remove someone from danger and still traumatize them. Ray's nervous system had learned the house, not as a concept, but as a map of safety cues. This corner is quiet. That chair means food is coming. That voice means I won't be touched. This doorway means outside. When officials later described the home as unfit, they weren't wrong. But what they could not fully account for was what the removal meant psychologically. Ray was not just leaving a building. He was losing orientation. For someone like Ray, orientation is everything. Without it, the world becomes noise. And this is where the delay matters. If Ray had received consistent professional support decades earlier, his world might have expanded gradually. New environments introduced slowly. New caregivers trained in his cues. New routines layered on top of old ones. But that didn't happen. Instead, the house deteriorated quietly while Ray adapted quietly. No inspections, no routine welfare checks, no sustained oversight, until cameras arrived. When the internet first saw the Whittaker home, many viewers reacted with horror, some with mockery, some with pity. But the most dangerous reaction was simplification. People wanted a villain, or a hero, or a rescue narrative. But the truth sat somewhere less satisfying. The home was failing because everyone in it was failing, not morally, but structurally. Aging bodies, limited income, addiction moving through the extended family. No safety net beneath them. When Ray barked or flinched on camera, people asked, "Why does he act like that?" The house was part of the answer. Constant instability, sensory overload. No quiet refuge except the familiar. No regulated space. And yet, despite all of this, the house functioned as Ray's anchor. This is why state intervention, when it came, was both necessary and devastating. Officials do not act based on emotional attachment. They act on risk. From their perspective, the Whittaker home was a health emergency. Gas leaks, fire hazards, sanitation failures, vulnerable adults unable to advocate for themselves. They saw imminent danger. What they could not fully see, and what systems are not built to measure, was the cost of sudden removal. The moment APS arrived, years of accumulated danger collided with decades of accumulated attachment. There was no gentle option left. The house that endangered Ray was also the only place his nervous system recognized as home. That paradox is the core tragedy here, and it explains why reactions to the removal are so divided. To some, the state saved Ray. To others, the state took him. Both interpretations exist because both contain truth. When the car drove away from the Whittaker property, it wasn't just Ray leaving. It was the end of an era of invisibility. The house that had hidden him for 70 years had finally been exposed. Not gradually, but all at once. And exposure brings consequences. In the next part, we're going to examine how that exposure happened. How cameras didn't just document the Whittakers, but changed the trajectory of their lives. How money entered the picture. How chaos escalated. And how a story that began as curiosity turned into a state emergency. Because Ray's removal didn't start with APS. It started when the world finally decided to look. For most of Ray Whittaker's life, nothing interrupted the slow decay of his world. The house deteriorated, the family aged, the isolation deepened, and Ray remained unseen. Then a camera arrived. Around 2020, a filmmaker and photographer drove down that narrow road in Odd, West Virginia, and recorded what no one outside the family had ever really witnessed. Ray pacing, barking, recoiling from eye contact, the cluttered yard, the collapsing rooms, the quiet despair that had lived there for decades without an audience. Those first videos didn't just document a hidden life. They changed it. Millions of people saw Ray for the first time, not as a neighbor, not as a person, but as a spectacle on a screen. Some reacted with concern, some with shock, some with laughter they didn't fully understand, and many reacted with a sudden urge to help. Donations poured in. 2 GoFundMe campaigns raised close to $100,000, ostensibly for repairs, food, utilities, and basic living support. For a brief moment, the internet believed it had found a redemption arc. Exposure would bring resources. Attention would bring safety. Cameras would save what isolation had broken. But attention is not neutral. Once money entered the story, the tone changed. View counts climbed. Comment sections filled with demands. People began asking questions not just about the house, but about where the money was going, who controlled it, and who decided how it was spent. The Whittaker family, already fragile, was suddenly under scrutiny from strangers who felt emotionally invested but had no real authority or accountability. Inside the home, pressure mounted. Ray did not understand why strangers were suddenly everywhere, physically and digitally. Cameras meant prolonged eye contact. Eye contact meant fear. Fear meant barking, flinching, retreating. What the audience interpreted as behavior was Ray's nervous system under siege. Meanwhile, the extended family fractured further. Larry's daughter, BJ, was struggling with addiction. Her actions would later deepen public outrage when it emerged that she had staged a false announcement claiming Larry had died, using the story to solicit donations. She later admitted it was a scam and said she wasn't proud of it. That moment mattered for more than the money. It confirmed something many viewers feared. The Whittaker story had become unstable, not just emotionally, but structurally. Addiction, poverty, and sudden access to funds created a volatile mix. Trust eroded. Filmmakers who initially wanted to help began pulling away, uneasy about the direction things were heading. Public disputes broke out between creators over ethics, control, and responsibility. Accusations of exploitation surfaced. Allegations flew faster than facts could keep up. The Whittaker home was no longer just a private disaster. It had become contested territory, and the cameras kept coming. New creators documented more than just Ray's behavior. They filmed drug use. They filmed unsafe conditions. They filmed arguments, tension, and neglect that no longer looked chronic but acute. What had once been a hidden problem was now amplified daily. At some point, filming stopped being documentation and started functioning as evidence. This is where the story crossed a critical threshold. One creator, after witnessing the conditions firsthand, decided the situation had gone beyond what cameras could ethically address. He contacted Adult Protective Services. That call mattered. APS doesn't respond to internet fame. They respond to risk. And by the time they arrived, the risk was no longer abstract. They saw what reporters would later describe in detail. Fire hazards, sanitation failures, vulnerable adults unable to advocate for themselves, drug use in proximity to people with severe disabilities, a home that could no longer be defended as merely poor or different. From a state's perspective, this was no longer a story. It was an emergency. The removal itself was quiet. No sirens, no spectacle, no dramatic confrontation, just a decision, a vehicle, and 3 people, Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy, driven away from the only place they had ever known. For viewers online, the removal felt sudden. For Ray, it was incomprehensible. He did not understand YouTube. He did not understand investigations. He did not understand why strangers had been watching his life for months. He only knew that one day, Unfamiliar hands closed the door, and the world he recognized disappeared. This is the cruel irony of exposure. The same cameras that finally made Ray visible also destabilized his environment so completely that intervention became inevitable. Without the footage, the state may never have acted. Because of the footage, the state had no choice but to act. Both statements can be true, and this is where narratives tend to harden. Some say the cameras saved Ray's life. Others say they destroyed it. But neither side fully captures what actually happened. The cameras functioned like sirens. Not gentle signals, but alarms. Loud, indiscriminate, impossible to ignore once activated. They drew attention, money, chaos, and eventually authority. And once authority arrives, control shifts permanently. Ray didn't get to consent to that shift. He didn't get to prepare for it. He didn't get to say goodbye in a way he could understand. The internet moved on to arguments about blame. Who exploited whom? Who should be charged? Who should be trusted? Ray moved into silence. When APS removed him, the filming largely stopped. The spectacle ended. The comments slowed. The world turned to the next controversy. But Ray's story didn't end. It just disappeared from view again, this time into confidentiality. Which brings us to the most difficult part of this entire story. After the sirens stop, after the cameras leave, after the headlines fade, what happens to someone like Ray? That is the question we're left with. In the next part, we'll sit with what we still don't know. What no footage can show. What no document fully captures. And why Ray's story forces us to confront something uncomfortable about how society treats people who cannot speak for themselves. Because the most important part of Ray Whittaker's life may be the part no one ever gets to see. After the car left the Whittaker property, Ray Whittaker disappeared again. Not into isolation this time, but into silence of a different kind. The silence of confidentiality. The silence of systems. The silence that follows when a story moves from public spectacle to protected case file. For the internet, that silence felt frustrating. For Ray, it was likely disorienting. What we know is limited, and that limitation matters. We know Ray was removed along with Lorraine and Timmy. We know they were placed somewhere under state care. We know the locations were kept confidential, as they should be. We know no public updates were promised, and none were owed. But the most important things are the ones we don't know. We don't know what Ray felt during that ride away from the land he had never left. We don't know whether he cried, froze, barked, or went completely still. We don't know whether anyone in that car understood what his sounds meant, or whether they were interpreted simply as noise. We don't know what his new environment looks like, whether it's quiet or loud, whether the smells are familiar or overwhelming, whether the routines are gentle or rigid, whether anyone there knows that sudden eye contact can feel like an attack to him, whether anyone knows that his barks are not aggression, but language. We don't know if anyone has taken the time to learn his patterns, the way his body tenses before he bolts, the sounds he makes when he's confused versus when he's afraid, the subtle ways he signals comfort or distress. And we don't know if Ray understands what happened to his family. From Ray's perspective, Betty and Larry didn't make a choice. They vanished. There was no explanation he could comprehend. No timeline. No reassurance that this separation was temporary or permanent. Just absence. One day, the people who had been there every day of his life were no longer there. That kind of rupture doesn't require words to be traumatic. It lives in the body. People often assume that because Ray is nonverbal, his emotional world must be simple. That assumption is wrong. His emotional world may be less articulated, but it is not less intense. If anything, it may be more raw, because he cannot buffer fear with explanation or logic. He cannot tell himself, "This is for my safety." He cannot ask, "When can I go home?" He cannot bargain, protest, or grieve in ways others recognize. so his body does the work. His nervous system absorbs the shock. It learns new rules. It adapts, because that's what survival looks like when you have no voice. This is the part of the story no camera captured. The removal solved one set of problems and created another set of unknowns. The collapsing house, the gas leaks, the neglect, the chaos, those were real dangers. But familiarity was also real. Attachment was real. Continuity was real. Ray's life was unsafe and known. Now it may be safer, but unknown. Both conditions carry cost. This is where the public conversation often fails. People want clean villains and clean heroes. They want to decide whether the state was right or wrong, whether the family loved him enough, whether the filmmakers helped or harmed. But Ray's life doesn't resolve into a verdict. It resolves into a question. What do we owe people like Ray before their lives become emergencies? Because nothing about his suffering was sudden. It accumulated over decades. Generations of genetic isolation, poverty, lack of access to services, a system that only noticed when camera arrived. The state didn't fail Ray in one moment. Society failed him slowly. He lived 70 years without consistent professional support, without meaningful intervention, without anyone asking whether the people caring for him were equipped to do so. Not because no one cared, but because he was invisible until he wasn't. And that visibility came with a price. The internet saw him, but it didn't know him. It reacted to what it could see, not to what it couldn't. And once attention turned into urgency, the system responded in the only way it knows how: removal. Removal is a blunt tool, sometimes necessary, often traumatic. And once it happens, the story fractures. One part lives in public memory. The other lives behind locked doors. Ray now exists in that second space. Protected, anonymous, unseen. That is both relief and loss. We may never know whether he is happier. We may never know whether he feels safer. We may never know whether he still looks for Betty's face or Larry's voice. And maybe we don't get to know, because the final truth of this story isn't about access. It's about restraint. Ray does not owe the world closure. He does not owe us updates, footage, or reassurance. His dignity does not depend on our understanding. What he owed the world was nothing. What the world owed him was protection long before a camera arrived. So what does that leave us? It leaves us with responsibility, not answers. Responsibility to question systems that wait for spectacle before they act. Responsibility to recognize that love and harm can coexist in the same household. Responsibility to stop confusing curiosity with care. And responsibility to remember Ray not as a viral figure, not as a symbol, not as a problem to solve, but as a man who lived a full lifetime largely unseen and who paid the price for society's neglect and silence. If this story makes you uncomfortable, that's not a failure. That's the point. Because Ray's life forces us to confront a truth we don't like to face. People like him exist everywhere, living in quiet danger, dependent on family members who are themselves unsupported, invisible until something goes wrong. The tragedy isn't that Ray was removed. The tragedy is that it took 70 years and a viral moment for anyone to notice he needed help. Tell me in the comments what you're feeling right now: grief, anger, confusion, relief. There is no correct response. There is only the question we're left with. What would it look like to care about people like Ray before the sirens start? Because once they do, it's already too late to pretend we didn't know. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.